In some grouping games on the LSAT, we are going to be presented with what I think of as designated slots or designated variables. Basically, the rules will tell us that one of the slots or one of the variables is special. They're going to be different from the other ones. And I want to show you two ways to handle that type of rule or restriction when we get it through this example. But let's take a look at what it says. 6 different students, PQRSTU, are going to be separated in 2 different teams, blue and indigo teams. So these are the 2 groups. Each of the groups have exactly 3 students. We're told that on each team, one of the students will be a leader and the other ones will be followers. So that's the kind of rule that I'm talking about. We have to designate one of the students on each team as a leader. So let me start with the basic setup here, which is we have 2 groups and each of these groups will get 3 people. But now how do we handle the fact that I have to designate one of the people in each group as a leader? Well, there are 2 potential ways to do that. One of them is to just write leader directly underneath or next to or above one of the slots in each group. So something like this is going to be the leader in the blue team and this is going to be the leader in the indigo team. Now the other way to handle the designated slot or variable rule is to just maybe write a floating L or even a star. Sometimes people would just use a star as whatever the designation is. But here I'll write L for leader. There's one leader in the blue group, and then there's another leader in the indigo group. And here we're not assigning the leader to a particular slot. We're just keeping track of the fact that one of these slots is going to be a leader. Now, I don't think that there's really any difference between the 2 kinds of setups. It's just that for some students, going with an approach like this might make certain inferences easier to see, whereas for others, maybe going with the other setup would make other inferences easier to see. So what I'll go ahead and do with this setup is I'll actually draw both of the setups, and then I'll show you how we might handle each of these rules and how we might come to the exact same deductions, and it doesn't really matter which setup we use. It's really up to you, your preference. So the first rule says that Q is on the blue team, and you can draw that in your list of rules like this, but of course it's much more important to put it directly into your diagram. If we go with the first setup, we know Q is going to go in the blue team, but we don't know whether Q is going to be a leader or not. So I have to just write the Q off to the side like this. If we went with this setup, however, we could just put the Q directly in a slot, and then if Q is the leader, we'll just assign the L over here. If Q is not a leader, then we'll assign the L somewhere else. So as you can already see, there is a little bit of an advantage with this second setup here because the fact that Q is occupying one of the 3 slots in the blue team is just a little bit easier to see over here than it is over here. Let's see how that plays out when we get to the other rules. The second rule says that T and U are assigned to the same team, so that's a TU horizontally like this. They always have to be horizontally in the same group. Now in the first setup here, I'm just visualizing this. It seems like I could put TU in blue or TU in I. It's not totally clear where that would go. In the second setup here, again, I could put TU either in these 2 slots in blue or in these 2 slots in I. So I can't really do anything with rule number 2 just yet. It does look like there's 2 options for where the TU go though. Now let's take a look at the third rule, which says that R and S cannot be assigned to the same team. So I'm going to do that as an RS block with a slash through it. But because there's only 2 groups, I actually want to draw this kind of rule directly into my diagram. If R and S cannot go in the same group, well, that means one of them is going to have to go in blue and one of them is going to have to go in indigo. So in this setup over here, because I don't know who's the leader, whether R is a leader or S is a leader or not, I'm going to have to draw an R/S in blue and an S/R in indigo to remind me that these have to be split up. If I go with this setup down here though, I could just draw an R/S directly into the slots. They have to be split up. They can't occupy the same group. Now here's where you can see that in the second type of setup, again, it's a lot easier to see that we have 2 of the blue team slots taken up. You can still see that in this setup over here, but again, it might be a little bit harder to see that. Now let's take a look at the last rule. P is not a leader. So in your list of rules, you could draw something like that. But of course, it's much more important to represent that in or near the main diagram. In the first setup, I'll just draw a P/ for the leader slots. For the other setup, I'll just draw a P/ next to the circled L. And now let's go ahead and see the kinds of inferences we can make in each of these setups. So we've already drawn in rule number 1, rule number 3, and rule number 4. The only rule left to think about is this TU. And remember, when we first thought about this rule, before we got to the other rules, it looked like T and U could go in both blue and indigo. But you'll notice, and here I'm going to focus on the first setup, you'll notice that if you try to put TU in blue, you're going to have 4 people, and that exceeds the number of slots. So it turns out that T and U actually have to go in the indigo group. So I would draw TU off to the side like this. Now that kind of inference in the second type of setup is a lot easier to make because, again, if you think about the TU, it's a lot easier to see that it doesn't fit in that last one slot, so TU would have to occupy these 2 slots in indigo. So if you don't think that you would have been able to see this inference that TU goes in indigo in the first kind of setup, then that by itself might make you want to practice with this setup where if you get a designated slot or variable type of rule, instead of writing that directly into a slot, you might just try to keep that open, leave that designation unassigned to be assigned later. Now I can't say that I personally always use this second kind of setup. In fact, I will probably often use the first kind of setup where I'll just draw the designation into a slot. It's just that when I do this, I'm on notice that I have to think about group sizes. And when I draw something off to the side like this, that actually puts a lot of constraints on each of the groups, even though if you're just looking at the slots look open. But don't feel like if I do a setup like this, you also have to do the same thing. In fact, it could be easier for you to do something else like the bottom setup. But there's a little bit more that we should do in these setups. Remember, once we figure out that T and U are going to go in the indigo group, well, now we know that the T, U, and 1 of S or R is going to be occupying the 3 slots of the indigo group. So that means the remaining person to be assigned, who is the P, is going to have to go in the other group. P would have to go in the blue group. The same thing would happen down here. P still has to be assigned. There's only 1 more slot, so P goes here. Now we also know that P is not going to be the leader, so if you're going with the first setup like this, maybe all that you'd really do is just draw maybe P is not going to be the leader like that. The leader in the blue group is either Q or it's going to be 1 of R or S, and in the indigo group, the leader could be anybody here. If you're going with a setup that's like this and you want to think about the fact that P is not leader, well that just means the leader is going to be either Q or R or S in the blue group, and the leader could be anybody in the bottom group. So what's the takeaway then from this video? Well, to me it's that when you get a rule about how you have to designate a particular slot or designate a particular variable as different from the rest, you can either do that by drawing the designation, tying it to a particular slot, or you can leave that designation almost like a floater. It doesn't actually matter which one you go with, except for some people the bottom type of representation where the designation is not tied to a particular slot is going to make it a little bit easier to see certain inferences relating to when a group is full. If you go with a setup like the top one, you just have to remember that when you start keeping track of letters off to the side as having to be assigned in a particular group, that does actually occupy 1 of the slots. Don't think of these slots as open when you have things written off to the side that have to be assigned to that group. And one more thing to keep in mind is if you start off with one of these kinds of setups, so let's say we started off with a fixed setup where we fixed an L to one of these slots, if in the middle of the rules or in making inferences we realize that that's a little bit constraining, there's nothing wrong with it than just erasing that L and just writing an L over here to be assigned to any of the slots. So don't feel like the initial setup that you went with at the start of the game is one that you have to stick to, especially when you realize that it may be limiting in the ways that you are drawing other rules or in your ability to see inferences.